sometime during spring semester when I was approached with the suggestion that we do a conference on World War II. The Ashbrook Center has been organizing conferences about one a year, sometime fall semester. And given the significance of the year, the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, we decided that was going to be a fitting subject. And we aimed to schedule it as close to VJ Day as possible. So I'm really excited with the lineup that we've gathered here. Some people from all over the country, some people who have been friends of mine for years, others I've only met for the first time today. I think you're going to be that at 7:30 p.m. is our viewing of the best years of our lives. This is a great film from 1946, won like 9 Academy Awards, and I could think of no film more suitable for what we're trying to do, because we're not merely talking about the war, but talking about the adjustment to peacetime. And that's exactly what this film is about, the experiences of 3 returning veterans trying to adjust to peacetime life. And that's going to be at the Ashland Theater. Sabrina worked it out for us that we're going to be in the main auditorium of the Ashland Theater. The seats are very comfortable. It's a beautiful space that was just fixed up. For those of you who are not from around here, it was about 5 years ago or something like that. It was fixed up, restored. This was a Shines Theater that originally opened in 1942 and has now been restored to at least some of its former glory. So I hope if you're available this evening, you will come out. Admission is free, although if you care to support the Ashland Theater, they would love it if you would buy some concessions. Now on to our speaker for this afternoon, for our opening keynote, is Robert M. Citino. Dr. Citino is senior historian at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, although he is a resident of Cleveland now, and in fact, a native of Cleveland. His father was a U.S. Army veteran of the Pacific War who fought at Guadalcanal. Dr. Citino received his bachelor's degree at The Ohio State University before earning a PhD in history from Indiana University, Bloomington. He has taught at the University of North Texas, Lake Erie College, Eastern Michigan University, the United States Military Academy at West Point, and the United States Army War College. Dr. Citino is editor or author of 13 books, most of which involve the history of the German armed forces during World War II. 2 of those books, Blitzkrieg to Desert Storm, The Evolution of Operational Warfare, and The Wehrmacht Retreats, Fighting a Lost War, 1943, won the Society for Military History's Distinguished Book Award. And in 2021, he was awarded the Society's Samuel Eliot Morrison Prize for his body of work on military history. His talk this afternoon is entitled Bloodbath, the Last Year of World War II. Please welcome Robert Citino. Thank you all for coming out this evening. I might be home working on my Henry Clay essay. And I've been asked to speak on the war year of 1945, and trying to make sense of the final year of World War II isn't as easy as it sounds. Strategically speaking, if you're looking at this as some kind of contest, a game of risk or Axis and allies, the game was over. The war was over. Axis forces had been smashed. They were on the run virtually everywhere. The contest was no longer in doubt, in other words. And once drama in a story is gone, it can be difficult to get people to continue to pay attention. But here's a basic fact that surprised me the first time I heard it, and I think continues to surprise people the first time they hear it. That brief war year of 1945, 4 months and some change in Europe,
and then a little over 6 months in Asia, was the bloodiest year of the war by far, at least in terms of military dead. Now, that should seem surprising. Simple math tells us that casualties in a partial year should be lower than casualties in a complete year. But in fact, some 2 million of roughly 7 million German war dead, about 30% in other words, rounding, died in 1945. Along with over 20% of all Soviet war dead, well over the expected average. The Germans invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941. The war ends in May of 1949. It's almost exactly 4 years. It's 48 months. So 4 months of 1945 is about a twelfth of the total. About 8% of the German-Russian war, but 20% of the Soviet war dead. And again, about 30% of the German war dead just in that partial year alone. So both of these are well over the expected averages. I can take you through the average for virtually every country involved. The point is probably already made, so I don't want to belabor it. So why? I've been teaching about war for decades. I just had my 67th birthday. I got a PhD longer ago than I can remember. I was in a college classroom for about 35 years. And I've noted this about my students. There's a thought out there about war. There's a scheme that wars open with a bang. Think Pearl Harbor, for a war opening with a bang. Then they reach a peak of violence before they slowly ebb. And then they finally stumble to an end when one side is had, when one side can no longer go on. But if you think about that, what you're doing there is turning war into a kind of novel, a literary piece, a fiction. You set the scene at the start. You build the tension. The tension builds to a climax, and then finally relaxes into denouement. Sure, you know what I'm talking about. Now, there is just one problem with that scheme, and I suppose every you all intelligent people, you all know what it is. War is not a novel. War is more than anything a wave of violence, a kind of spasm. It's about destruction and killing, where you set aside every rule, law, and sacred commandment we've been taught, and willingly, even eagerly, kill one another. Now, the great Prussian philosopher of war, you see him here on the screen, Karl von Clausewitz, noted all this 200 years ago. In the course of my teaching career, my students could play a drinking game by the number of times I would mention Clausewitz. Probably, I wanted to get it out of the way early here. So, 200 years ago, Clausewitz wrote that war was an act of violence. He went on, it's not just an act of violence, that's a bar brawl. But war is an act of violence to compel our enemy to do our will. There's something that your enemy doesn't want to do that you want them to do, and you have decided that negotiations, position papers, round tables will no longer suffice to compel your enemy to do what you want. And so, in one of the famous formulations, again from Clausewitz, you roll the iron dice and you go to war. Now, Clausewitz wasn't just theorizing. He has spent a lifetime in the field. He's spent a lifetime fighting the Napoleonic Wars. He was a Prussian army officer. I'll mention that he fought on both sides. Prussia was an enemy of Napoleon, and then Prussia was an ally of Napoleon, and then Prussia was once again an enemy of Napoleon. He came back and forth in the Napoleonic Wars. And he noted that great wars don't simply peter out. They keep getting worse the longer they drag on. The violence, he said, keeps ratcheting up. It was a reciprocal process until that violence becomes unrestrained. But by the end, both sides have taken off the gloves, they've abandoned all restraint, and they would do things they couldn't have dreamt of doing a few years ago when the fighting began. I mean, one example in World War II is the British Royal Air Force, the RAF, began bombing Germany very early on in the war. And they began by dropping leaflets When you fly over your adversary's big cities, you drop leaflets. This struggle is hopeless. Hitler's a maniac. Get rid of him. There's still time to be readmitted into the concert of nations. Urging the Germans to behave better. And of course, in the middle of the war, those leaflets turned to bombs, and at some point in the war, turned to incendiary bombs. The destruction of Dresden in early 1945 being the best example. But it goes for virtually every single power in the war, one way or the other. What we speak of as a kind of ratcheting up of violence, the reciprocal actions. Oh, is she triggered? There it is. There's a line you can take home. Clausewitz has a series of very, very quotable lines if you study the theory of war. An act of violence to compel your enemy to do your will. The continuation of politics by other means. You sit down with your adversary and you discuss the border issue that's troubling you both. It goes back and forth, and one side makes concessions, the other doesn't make sufficient concessions. There might be insults. Frank words are spoken around the table, the talks break down. But the issue is still there, and then you may go to war with the same issue. He also said it's fundamentally an act of chance. Once the armies engage on the battlefield, once you send your air forces over the enemy's homeland, almost anything can happen, and don't be surprised when anything does. So it's a mixture of violence, that's that quote. It's a mixture of policy, continuation of politics, politique, the German word, policy or politics. And then an act of chance that kind of sweetens the whole thing. That was Clausewitz, as he called it, the trinity of war. The amazing Wunderlich trinity. But we're interested today in the violence. So, my point, Clausewitz would not have been all surprised that World War II ended, not with a famous literary formulation, not with a whimper or even a bang, but with an absolute bloodbath for everyone involved, victor and vanquished alike. In fact, my guess is if we could resurrect Carl and bring back, he'd probably say it was a textbook case. Now, what I'd like to talk about this afternoon are the specific causes. I might say the recipe for this bloodbath. Clausewitz gives us a general philosophical principle. But the recipe for this specific bloodbath. And I would say that recipe was embedded in the wartime strategies adopted by both sides. You obviously have forces fighting forces at the end of World War II. But in many ways, you also had two strategic postures, two irreconcilable strategies that virtually guaranteed the war would go on to the bitter end, and I would say in this case, even beyond the bitter end. So, you may have heard in your studies, you may have come across the phrase unconditional surrender. The Allies in World War II proclaimed that they were fighting for the unconditional surrender of the Axis, their adversaries, Germany, Japan, and Italy. No negotiations, no terms being offered, no positions being exchanged back and forth by the diplomats. Complete surrender. The Axis will put itself at the mercy of the victorious Allied powers. And the war was going to go on until they agreed to do just that. It was first enunciated, I like to think I have it, there we go. It was first enunciated by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt at a press conference at the end of the Casablanca Conference in January of 1943. The Allies had landed in North Africa and followed the sort of thing, Operation Torch. There was a big international conference in Casablanca once they overrun Morocco, essentially the big two, and that's Roosevelt and Churchill. And at the end of the conference, there's a press, at the end of the Casablanca Conference, there's a press conference. The reporters say, what did you talk about, and what comes out of these discussions? And FDR announced there would be no negotiations with the enemy, no negotiations with Hitler. Instead, the total overthrow of the Axis. Regime change, we might say in a modern context, would be the order of the day. And the war was going to be fought until the Axis regimes were overthrown. Quoting from one greatest presidents, one of our great wartime presidents. FDR said the elimination of Germany, Japan, and Italy, and Italian war power means the unconditional surrender, that's the phrase, of Germany, Italy, and Japan. That means a reasonable assurance of world peace. It does not mean the destruction of the population of Germany, Italy, and Japan. So this isn't Rome and Carthage. Everyone's going to be, the women and children be sold off as slaves, and all the men are going to be killed, and the land sown with salt, so nothing would ever grow there again. The famous Carthaginian peace after the Third Punic War. This isn't that. It does not mean the destruction of the populations of Germany, Italy, and Japan. It does mean the destruction of the philosophies in those countries, which are based on conquest and the subjugation of other people. So quite eloquent statement. So if you are, if you're following wartime events, say, well, one thing we're sure of, according to what the president just said, there won't be a Hitler government after the end of the war. Hitler's going to have to go. He embodies those very principles that Roosevelt said we could not live with, based on conquest, the subjugation of other peoples, the evaluation of some peoples as worthy and other peoples as inferior. That's precisely what Roosevelt's talking about. He's leading with his principles, and it's something that the U.S. president does, particularly in wartime. This isn't about horse trading. We want better trade, we want a better trade deal, and we'll give you a slice of the border. It's not about horse trading. It's about fundamental concerns. So, I guess we could put it this way. No quarter from the Allies. The Allies are telling the Axis powers there'll be no quarter, no mercy. Now, I think we can say this. The policy was mainly FDR's baby. Probably fits in a little better with the American way of war than what we might perceive as the British way of war. And indeed, Churchill claimed to have been surprised when FDR announced it at a press conference. He later said that outright. The president surprised me. Now, we now know today that he wasn't surprised. He knew what FDR was going to say, and the two of them had discussed unconditional surrender in private session. But perhaps Winston, Sir Winston, was laying the groundwork to disavow the strategy if it did work. Because we must take note here. Unconditional surrender is not how 99% of the wars in human history have ever ended. They've almost always, the vast majority of cases, almost always ended a long time before it came to unconditional surrender. Usually when one side felt was beaten. The turning points have all turned. And it's clear our situation is hopeless. Why get completely destroyed by superior military power? Wars usually end with some kind of negotiated settlement, no matter how horrible they've been. And if you want witness for that, witness the previous war, World War I, which stopped quite short of the absolute overthrow of Germany. In fact, Allied forces weren't even on German soil when the war ended. That war did come to a negotiated settlement. So, unconditional surrender, the Allies' strategic posture heading into the last couple of years of the war. On the other side of the hill, the Axis side, I'm going to concentrate on the Germans today. And as you can probably already tell by the tone of my remarks, I'm really most interested here in Europe. You're going to have a closing keynote, if I'm not mistaken, by Richard Frank, authority on the end of the war in the Pacific. Rich is a good friend of mine. We'll take you through chapter and verse on that. But let's talk about Hitler and his Hitler and his Nazi minions, I guess is the best way to put it. They were never a moderate bunch to begin with. I hope I don't have to tell you that. Not really a kinder and gentler regime. But they greatly radicalized their own conduct of the war the longer it went on. German strategy for the war's end. We've got unconditional surrender on one side. Germany's strategy for the war's end consisted of something called total war. Simple German, Totalkrieg. Proclaimed in a speech by propaganda minister Josef Goebbels at the Berlin Sportpalast, the big arena in downtown Berlin, in February of 1943. And there's Goebbels speaking at the podium of the Sportplatz in February 1943. Goebbels declared here in this speech, total war is the order of the day. The Fuhrer has commanded, and we will follow. In this hour of national reflection and contemplation, we believe firmly and unshakably in victory. We see it before us. We need only grasp it. Let the slogan be now, people rise up and let the storm break loose. Und Sturm bricht los, and let the storm break loose. So, no quarter from the Allies, no surrender from the Germans. Germany would fight to the end, Goebbels said, refusing to negotiate, refusing to settle, making Allied victory as expensive as possible through the fanatical resistance of the German people, to the point where even the Allies saw the hopelessness of their cause. It would be a French Revolution style, a levée en masse, if you know that phrase from your studies, the big call-up of the entire French nation during the Revolution. Men, women, children, the elderly, the whole people rising up. Now specifically, to get some specifics, the plan was to call up last-ditch levies of troops like the Volksgrenadier divisions. These were made up of manpower combed out of rear areas, supply troops, administrative troops, office personnel, even lightly wounded men taken from their hospital beds. I said lightly wounded. That's not correct. Not all of these inductees into the Volksgrenadier division still had all their arms and legs, and they were being called to the front. And the point was to keep alive the flame of resistance. When those reserves were exhausted, you won't be surprised to know that the supply clerk, who may be in his late 30s or early 40s, is probably not prime infantry material for battle in the field. When those reserves were exhausted, and I would say by late 1944, just for the beginning, Germany turned to Volkssturm battalions, People's Assault battalions, I would say People's Militia, comprised of old men. Oh, there's people rise up in the storm break loose. I should have shown that. There's an inductee into the Volkssturm, comprised of old men and young boys. Grandmas and grandsons in the same unit. Typical German terminology, Hans und Opa. Grandson and grandfather fighting in the same unit. Given a single shot anti-tank weapon, that's what he's holding there. He's holding Panzerfaust, as they were known in Germany, and sent out to do or die versus the invaders. Now, the Panzerfaust was a really terrifying anti-tank weapon. It's shaped charge, if you know much about the physics of explosives. It hits the broad side of the tank and almost certainly blows a hole in it and destroys the tank and kills everyone inside. But you have to be about 100 yards away from the tank. And that's well within the tank's machine gun distance, not even a main gun. A Panzerfaust was a suicide weapon. The Germans pioneered a sort of suicide bomber mentality in World War II through their Volkssturm. So Hitler came to power in 1933, and you were 5, and you joined the Hitler Youth by 1940, and you were 12. And now by 1944, you're 16. And the Hitler Youth were now inducted almost wholesale into the field, Volkssturm. Likewise, this gentleman almost certainly, if you look at the timeline, almost certainly fought in World War I for Germany. And now he's been called back. Does the uniform still fit? Is the leadership adequate? Is he prepared to go into the field for modern mechanized warfare? I hope you know the answer to all these questions is no, but this is part of Germany's total war strategy. Interestingly, I might add, because it's a question that often gets asked, Germany never did fight total war. Despite the slogans, the Germans, Nazis, love their propaganda slogans. They had one for every occasion. But Germany never really did fight total war. There's a major portion of the population that was never drafted, not even working in the factories, and that's German women. Now, the Germans got around that by using slave labor, captured prisoners of war, especially captured prisoners from from the campaigns in the East, in Poland, and especially in the Soviet Union. But nevertheless, this is a sign, I think, of German total war. We'll keep that one out. I find this to be a striking photo. Everybody else is waiting their chance back there. They're going to learn to fire a compromise. The idea was to force the Allies to bleed for every inch of ground they took. Eventually, probably in Great Britain, but the United States first, the Germans felt, enemy morale would crash and shatter the grand alliance of Russia, the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States that was fighting the Germans. You know, Hitler loved to quote the Prussian King Frederick the Great, who was once asked about his strategy against a coalition enemy in the 7 Years' War. What we call in North America the French and Indian War is the 7 Years' War in Europe, 1756 to 63. And Prussia was one of the key players in the 7 Years' War, and they had one of the greatest commanders of the day, their king, Frederick the Great. And he answered, somebody asked, what's your strategy against this coalition? He said, strategy? There is no strategy. We're going to keep fighting this war until one of our goddamn enemies gets tired. And Hitler said pretty much the same thing in just about those same words in 1944. He told his generals at the time, we're going to convince the enemy that whatever he does, he can never count on our surrender. Never. Ever. This is Hitler's speech to his commanders on the verge of the Ardennes offensive of the Battle of the Bulge. He gathered all the generals with him. You might say a pre-battle pep talk about what this all meant. He said, we're going to convince our enemies that we will never surrender. They will never beat us. And just for emphasis, Hitler was a speech maker of some skill. Never, he said. Never. Probably something you never do. So, this is my point. I hope I'm not overburdened here. Unconditional surrender versus total war. Who started it? Was total war a Nazi response to the Allied demand for unconditional surrender? Because sometimes you read that in some histories. Or was unconditional surrender an Allied response to the already clear evidence of Axis atrocities and fanaticism? You read that as well. I won't settle that issue right now, but it's something worth discussing. What comes first? It's a chicken and egg question, in other words. And I believe our friend Karl von Clausewitz would say it really doesn't matter. Wars increase in intensity the longer they drag on, and strategy becomes more intransigent. This is a very, very point he made. What's fascinating to me is I hear myself talking about these two strategies. These diametrically opposed visions. One side saying, when fight you surrender, the other side saying, we'll never surrender. The background, the context of these diametrically opposed visions, the ones that defined the war's endgame and made 1945 such a horror show, came at exactly the same moment. The chicken and the egg showed up at exactly the same moment. January, February 1943. At that moment, the war was actually going badly for both sides. The Germans had just senselessly sacrificed an entire field army, the biggest force in the field, at Stalingrad, surrounded by the Soviets in November 1942 and finally surrendered in the first days of February 1943. But the Allies weren't doing much better. They were having a hard time getting untracked, and especially the Western Allies. Their armies were still mired in Tunisia, of all places. Now, Tunisia, anyway you start, is a long way from Berlin. Is it even on the road to Berlin? Depending on how you look at the map, the Allies had reasons for invading North Africa, but you're a long, long way from Berlin. At sea, merchant shipping, the Allied lifeline, and especially the Western Allied lifeline, was being sunk wholesale by German U-boats in early 1940. So my point, victory seemed a long way off for both sides. And so, as Julius Caesar might say, Jacta alia est, the die is cast for 1945. An irresistible force, the full range of Allied military power, and I think we can probably say those three countries of the Grand Alliance amassed more sheer military power than any power or group of powers at any previous time in world history. An irresistible force, the Allies, was about to crash into an apparently immovable object, and that would be the German people in full Nazi mode. 80 million plus, men, women, and children ready to die rather than surrender. This is the context for 1945. Now, with your indulgence, I'm going to add a month and start in December of 1944. Let's begin with the great curtain raiser of this final phase of the war in December of 1944. The great German counteroffensive in the Ardennes Forest. The Ardennes Forest is kind of a triangle between France, Britain, and Belgium. Luxembourg is stuck almost completely in the middle, kind of a triangle of those two countries. Now, this offensive came as a bolt out of the blue to U.S. commanders, all the way up to General Eisenhower, the supreme commander in the West. The attack, the Germans called it Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine. Here in the United States, it has become the Battle of the Bulge. That's how it's much better known. This attack saw multiple German armies smash into a weakly held portion of the U.S. line. The attack made good progress at first. It took thousands of U.S. POWs, and it threw a real scare into the Allies. And the reason for that is they believed that Germany was already beaten and that the war was all but over. You know, there's some intelligence bubbling up on the front. Looks like the Germans are up to something. But in the upper echelons of Allied command in Europe, the Germans have kind of been beaten badly enough in Normandy and their retreat back to their own country that they really wouldn't be able to launch another major offensive. Many of you, I'm sure, in the room know the phrase confirmation bias. Everyone thinks something, so you only look for evidence that proves the thing that everyone thinks. Do you want to be the one intelligence officer out of 200 who says to Eisenhower, I think evidence is wrong? I think I'm right. And it's a very, very difficult thing to do, and frankly, no one ever really did that on the American or British side. So the Germans did good work in camouflaging, so in making the attack a surprise. All their movements by night, airplane engines revving up constantly so no one heard the clank of tanks coming to the front line positions. There's things you can do. False radio traffic, announcing things that aren't really going to happen. But really the problem was how wedded the Allies were to this notion that the Germans were all beaten. So, pretty rough opening for especially for the U.S. Army. This is largely U.S. troops fighting the Germans here. A couple of tough defensive stands, I think we can see it on the map, at places like Bastogne, right there in the middle of that German post, and then to the north at the town of Saint-Vit. A couple of tough U.S. defensive stands blunted the German drive by late December. So it's December 16th, and really the German momentum has cracked, let us say, within 2 weeks. But bloody fighting continued well into January of 1945, as the U.S. Army slowly drove the Germans back to their starting lines and beyond. Now, next to D-Day, next to what happened on Omaha Beach, the Bulge is probably the most famous, the epic episode of the U.S. Army in the European theater in 1944, 1945. And the Bulge lived on in U.S. memory. Every serving U.S. Army officer can quote you chapter and verse on the Battle of the Bulge. They all learned it very early on in their education. I taught at West Point for a year, a visiting professor, very honored to be asked. And a big portion of the curriculum was parsing what happened in the Battle of the Bulge. You know, and both, I'm proud to say as an American that not only the satisfactory, the proud closing, but also the tough opening is something that's taught all the time about the risks of being surprised on a battle. But above all, when you think of the Battle of the Bulge, you should remember the sacrifice. 81,000 U.S. casualties, the bloodiest single battle in U.S. military history, suffered in this brutal fight in a war that everyone in Washington thought was already over. And that really, I say curtain raiser. That, the bulge, the Ardennes counteroffensive, from a German perspective, the bulge sets the tone for 1945. We'll go through some quick operational précis, and I have no intention of subjecting you to entire blow by blow for what's about to come, but just a few highlights. On land in 1945, Martha, you up there? Oh. Try that again. Okay, well, we'll just stop it. On land, the Allies pulled out all the stops, launching an assault into the German Rhineland, the western portions of Germany, to the west of the Rhine River in January and February. This campaign was filled with bitter, gritty, urban fighting. This is one of the most highly urbanized portions of Germany and most densely populated. So if you want a battle, if you want to study a battle that generates higher than average casualties, any urban battle. When the defender can hold up in a stone building, you pretty much have to blast through the city stone building by stone building. And anytime you cross the street, there might be a German machine gun trained on you. An urban battle will fit the bill. After that, in March, the Allies crossed the Rhine River at Remagen, and then followed up with this, the encirclement of an entire German army group in the Ruhr district in March and April. In the encirclement and destruction of Army Group B, as you can see under General Vogel, the Germans probably suffered 500,000 casualties. But the Americans suffered, maybe in the total fighting, it's a series of separate actions. Tough to call it one campaign. The Americans probably suffered another 50 to 60,000 casualties. This is bloody fighting all around. Now, in the east, the Red Army, the Soviet Army, erupted out of its bridgeheads on the Vistula River, the river that runs through Warsaw, in January. They overran Germany's eastern provinces, East Prussia, Posen, Pomerania, in February and March, and then made the final drive into the heart of Berlin in April. Now, and of course, at the end of the war, Hitler will come to an end that we'll talk about in a moment. All these fights, I've already mentioned about the Rhineland, Battle of Berlin, all of these fights generated spectacular casualties. And frankly, I do operational analysis, I draw arrows, how these work, but it almost ceases to matter for much of this campaign season. The real salient factor of the spectacular casualties on all sides. But having said that, they were in many ways one-sided. The fully mechanized Allied armies, bursting with supplies, fresh manpower, were killing their adversaries, in droves. All those Hansas and Obas we mentioned, slaughtering them really. Still, enough defenders remained in the field, German defenders, to make approaching a German village something of a crapshoot for any Allied unit. You might get a surrender offer from the town. The mayor might come out with a white flag and say, please, the war's over for us. Or you might get a blizzard of machine gun fire, all depending on the spirit, the attitude, the morale of the local German defenders. Now, the eventual solution to that problem, and I would say this is especially true for the U.S. Army, the eventual solution to that problem was to shoot first. Open up with every weapon you had and flat the place. Just destroy it. I mean, it's easier than sending a squad forward against ambush. So they didn't expect any German defenders to be still active in the area. So just open up and have a mad moment of American firepower. It was the same in the air. This is probably a part of World War II that most people are not pretty familiar with. Allied air forces leveled Germany city by city, town by town. The U.S. Army Air Forces, no independent air force yet, no USAF, part of the Army. The USAAF and the British RAF enjoyed not merely air superiority, you can drive your enemy out of the sky in local areas, but absolute air supremacy. They could fly where they want with almost no fear of being molested. They bombed cities, and then they rebombed the rubble until literally there was nothing left to bomb. And famously at Dresden in February 1945, second mention of this, they burned an entire city to the ground. Now there's also a method here. It wasn't simply a paroxysm of mindless violence as it might sound. The Allies were trying to destroy Germany's railroad net, and thus the destruction of the German economy, something they had achieved pretty adequately by early 1945. Well, while the Allies were seeking unconditional surrender in that inimitable fashion, Nazi total war kept pace. The Germans kept tightening discipline in the ranks, shooting, hanging thousands, tens of thousands of their own men on often bogus charges of cowardice, as a way to encourage the others to fight to the end. Now, if Germany needed anything in early 1945, it needed manpower, but that conflicted with the rigors of total war. Wanted to make sure that the men in the field were sufficiently cowed that they wouldn't even think of surrendering. If you look at the Wehrmacht, I use the term for the German armed forces, usually coterminous with the army. If you look at the Wehrmacht's final path of retreat, you're going to see it filled with thousands of soldier victims hanging from lampposts or gallows. Germans killed by their own government. The regime also targeted its own officer corps, arresting entire families and holding them as hostages to encourage loyalty to the officer corps. Famously, of course, back in July of 1944, a handful of German officers, not generals, but even colonels for the most part, kind of middle management, launched a plot against Hitler and tried to kill him, blew up a bomb in his command bunker in East Prussia. That set Hitler off, but by the end of the war, it had reached entirely new levels of holding as hostage the families of virtually all the top-ranking German generals. In this increasingly deranged environment, I felt my whole life, Hitler was crazy. Like I said, we need better explanations of the phenomenon. But this was a deranged social and military environment operating in the German command by the end of the war. In this deranged environment, when exactly to hang out your white flag was a very delicate operation, even a matter of life or death. Now, the Americans are attacking. They demand you surrender. And if you hesitate too long, the Americans are going to destroy your village. Surrender too early before the Americans have really gotten there, and a squad of SS men might march through your neighborhood, shooting you, your family, and just about everyone they could get their hands on. This happened repeatedly in the final battle for Berlin. In street fighting, you take a block, and then the adversary counterattacks and retakes the block. And then you have to launch another attack again. There's so many ways in and out of Berlin blocks. If you think about it, in the sewer. So in Berlin, blocks change hands. And they're changing, in this case, the Soviets, so the Red Army would break in, and you take the picture of Hitler off the wall, and I don't know, get a copy of the Communist Manifesto. And then your own side, the Germans would come back, and you'd take Stalin off the wall and put Hitler back off the wall, and make sure Mein Kampf was in a visible place. It has semi-comic overtones, but of course not funny at all. It's people really doing whatever they can to survive what looks unsurvivable. Now finally, at the bitter end, maybe the ultimate act of total war, Hitler decided to destroy every road, bridge, dam, and factory in Germany. Hitler. To do exactly what the Allies were doing in other words, to destroy the German economy, German society, and in some sense, Germany itself. Hitler, at his core, was a Darwinian. It's a malignant version of Darwinism, I would say, but it is nevertheless informed by Darwinian views. He believed that since the German people had lost the war, they had proven themselves unworthy to live. They were unworthy to call themselves a nation. So they had best be destroyed. Now, a few officials, Albert Speer, one of Hitler's top minions, managed to sabotage those orders, but just barely. It's closer, I think, than anyone realizes. And of course, when all was lost, Hitler paid the ultimate homage to his concept of total war by killing himself. We might say, human sympathy notwithstanding, which after anyone who's passed to the other side, it was a miserable end to a miserable life. He still had millions of young, very young men in the field fighting in his name. And at the very least, you owe them something. The general who, I don't know, who disappears or takes some kind of alternate way out, doesn't take responsibility for what has happened, doesn't strike me as honorable leadership or honorable generalship in any way, shape, or form. So I'll end with that. As a historian, maybe all of you, those of you studying history and those faculty members in the room too, maybe you share this with me. I often find myself wishing that I had been present at some signal event in world history. Watching Alexander the Great enter Persepolis, I wish I had been there. Or the coronation of Charlemagne, or drinking a schnapps with Frederick the Great, or other amazing times and places too numerous to mention. But as I look at Europe in 1945, I have to say, and I'll paraphrase Hitler himself, but kind of give him the last word in a way. I never find myself wishing I'd been alive in Europe in 1945. Never. Ever. Thank you very much.
If you would like to ask a question, we have microphones at the end of each aisle.
I'd like to ask a question here. Up front here. In 1944 and 1945, slave labor was a huge part of the German industrial force. What was the degree of industrial sabotage?
I don't think we'd ever be able to put a statistical number on it. But we have to assume you're taking a prisoner of war from the Polish army or the Soviet army, carted him into Central Europe, put him in a subterranean factory, you kind of chained him to his drill press or chained him to his lathe, you're feeding him minimally. There can be purposeful sabotage, certainly. I'm sure there were loads of it. But there's also this kind of unintentional sabotage that comes from having the worker falling asleep or shaky hands or unable to focus because he's suffering from one or more communicable diseases, probably all tracing back to being kept alive on 1,000 calories per day. That's the situation. So I don't know if I could give you a number, but at least anecdotal reports from the front, German tank crews spoke more and more often of the number of dud shells they seem to be sending towards the enemy. And that, I have no reason to disbelieve that. That's probably coming from the question that you're addressing.
Well, second of all, how reliable are the stats as far as the overall casualties of?
Oh, the stats.
Yeah.
There's a stat. You can choose your stats for casualty levels in World War II. One of the big, I think America suffered 400 and some thousand, less than 410,000 casualties a day in World War II. I think we're pretty firm on that. America keeps good, firm statistics. Most of the Western nations do. The Germans kept great statistics, but of course they were all obliterated at the end of the war in various kinds of bombing and the sort of general chaos of the end of the war. It's not like anyone was reporting to work systematically in the archives for the last couple of months of the war. But here's the real wild card. And by the way, I said the same thing for the Japanese. The cities were obliterated at the end of the war, so trying to get firm statistics can be very, very difficult. The real wild card for statistics, though, is the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union would alter their statistics based on the political needs of the moment. If the government wanted to emphasize how awful the struggle with Germany had been, they'd raise the number. But if they didn't want to be accused of incompetence, and this is particularly so of how many people died in Leningrad during the war, they often downplayed that figure. Leningrad didn't have to be as well inland. It didn't have to be surrounded by the Germans. More civilians could have been evacuated. There's a lot of things that could have been done. So depending on the political need of the moment, the numbers rise and fall. you'll see today total number of dead in the Soviet Union, that's military and civilian, somewhere in the 30 million range. When I was, when we were both youngsters, coming up, going to Ohio State in the mid-70s, it was 20 million. And now it's well over 30. There are some Soviet scholars, Boris Sokolov is one of them. He's kind of an outlier. He said, no, it's closer to 40. I don't normally say this. I can't believe I'm about to. Go to Wikipedia and check out the World War II casualties page. At the very least, it will give you an idea of the vast number of, the vast variety of numbers that are being brooded about. But don't list Wikipedia as a source. That's something that's nice.
Dr. Citino, you pick the questions. I don't want to pick.
What's
You
that?
pick the people. Raise your hand if you have a question. You pick.
Who's got their hand up? That gentleman right there in the middle, white hat.
Thanks.
How would you rate the Soviet generalship in the last year of the war?
That's a good question. I was born in 1958, so I came of age in the midst of the Cold War, when we really didn't like to talk too much about the Soviet Army as our ally. They were our ally in World War II, of course, because now they were our bitter adversary. We were almost certainly going to have a war with them at some point. So I often think that we took our views of the Soviet Army from their German adversary. All the German generals wrote their memoirs. Heinz Guderian and Erich von Manstein and Friedrich von Mellenten and others too numerous to mention, which little Robbie gobbled up when he was 10 and 12 years old. I couldn't get enough of that when I was growing up. And they said the entire Soviet Army was a mindless horde. They were awful. Their fighting qualities were awful. Their men were subhuman primitives who couldn't walk and chew gum at the same time. And the only way they were able to beat the Germans was overwhelming them with masses of fresh recruits, often thrown forward even without a rifle. Mellenten, in his book Panzer Battles, German General Friedrich von Mellenten, says that it's hard for anyone who has not fought the Russians to realize how primitive the soul of this Asiatic people is. It's amazing stuff when you look back on it. NATO officers were, swallowing that because it seemed to offer insight to the Soviets. So I'd be one of those who I think has done some work to kind of equalize that a bit, or at least to make analysis a bit more fair. The Soviet Army in 1941 was terrible. Stalin had just murdered all his officers. There was one purge after the other. The Soviets took 4 million casualties, dead, wounded, and prisoners, mainly prisoners, in the opening 6 months of the war with Germany. Any other country on earth would have had to surrender at that point, not Stalin's Soviet Union. But by 42 and 43, that had changed, and the Germans defeated Stalingrad late 1942, which the Soviets played the waiting game until the Germans had shot their logistical boat and were nearly immobile because they had no fuel, and launched a big counteroffensive on Stalingrad. Good stuff. Then 43, just 6 to 8 months later, the battle occurs. Soviets showed they could go toe-to-toe with the Germans, give the Germans all the time they wanted. Well, let me finish the question first. I'll promise again. Okay? Wow. Let me answer this gentleman's question first, and I promise I'll get to you. Okay? So they proved they could go toe-to-toe with the Germans. 1944, biggest Soviet offensive of the war in Belarus, the Minsk offensive. Wiped another German army group off the map. So this is, by the end of the war, the Soviets, I think, were learning to replace men with machines, more and more tanks, more and more aircraft, more and more air power, and in that sense, to become more modern. I think they always had a pretty high skill level in the upper office corps, particularly about the middle of the war. Yes, sir. We got a microphone for you?
Yes, you said that the Soviet casualties in the last 45 were greater than the Soviet casualties in 42 or 43.
Yeah.
Is that count civilian as well as military?
Look at the number I gave. Thank you for pointing this out. I want to make this specific. The number I gave was strictly for military. Soviets, if you say 35 million Soviet citizens died in the war, you have millions and millions and billions for every year of the conflict. But thank you for pointing this out. The number I gave was strictly military casualties. Because I'll tell you why. By now, the Germans were off the soil of the Soviet Union. But by and large, the civilians are still dying accidents in factories and
Between military, 45 is greater than 43.
yes, absolutely. And again, the point I want to emphasize about that is it's a partial year, it's only a little over 4 months. Right here, I see my friend. I met everybody, wow, but so everybody else in there. I met everybody in the front row.
I have several questions, but I'll stick with one.
Okay.
I understand that 8 out of 10 Germans in World War II were killed by the Soviet Union.
Yes.
My students are very surprised by that. Battle of the Bulge, D-Day, North Africa. 8 out of 10 Germans in World War II were killed by the Soviet Union.
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
I think it's incontrovertible. Doesn't matter whether we agree with it or not. It is true. But at any given, and we didn't really talk much about it during the Cold War. It would have meant giving Joseph Stalin and the Soviets, the communists, too much credit for Allied victory in World War II. I think enough time has passed, including the Soviet Union has passed. I think we can also talk about this today. At any given moment, the war, 70 to 80% of the German army was deployed on the Eastern Front against the Soviets. Even D-Day in the West, Omaha Beach and the other beaches, the great campaign across Europe, the Germans brought a couple of, Panzer divisions, some elite units from the East. But even at that time, probably never did under 70%. So going from that, if you say 70 to 80% of the Germans were in the East, that's where they got killed. These battles, look, in the Battle of Stalingrad, the German 6th Army started the campaign in 1942 with 275,000 men. They'd been whittled down by the time it got to Stalingrad, losses in the field and such. But in Stalingrad, it was still over 200,000 men, and then it was surrounded. And then it was eventually starved and surrendered wholesale. By the time it surrendered, it only had 90,000 men left. So already there you're looking at a couple of 100,000 in a single campaign. The Soviet front, of course, is much bigger. It's not always that the fighting was more ferocious. It's just there's a lot more of it. It's a much bigger front than you would find in Western Europe. So no, that's absolutely 100% true. 80%, I have to look at the exact statistic. I guess I made a call from some patron at the museum as I was doing. It was 79.8. So let's see. Yes. Okay, we have over here first tonight.
If Hitler wouldn't have killed himself at the end of the war, how far do you think he would have gone in his total war tactic? Like, do you think he would have started sending the women or like elementary age children, or even going so far as to like start bombing his own communities to keep them out of Allied hands?
Yeah, how far Hitler would have gone and things gone differently is always something we can conjure with. And, the Man in the High Castle, there's this one novel after the other that tries to deal with some ultimate ending. But I think to answer your question, let's just look at a timeline. At the moment Hitler kills himself in late, it's not May, it's the end of April, about 45. The Soviets are standing on top of his bunker in Berlin. I mean, the Soviets have conquered Berlin. I think on May 2nd, they're going to hoist the hammer and sickle flag over the Reichstag in central Berlin. So there is really no, I guess Hitler could have done this. Earlier, before the Soviets closed the ring around Berlin, he could have fled Berlin. Could have gone down to the Alps, built himself some kind of fort there that actually the Allies were worried about, that he might do just this, and try to rally resistance to go on for months and months and months. So who knows what might have come of that. But the way it worked out, at the moment Hitler killed himself, he truly felt, he was in a hopeless situation. He had a deathly fear of being imprisoned, put on trial. He used to say, kept in a cage, not going to be put into any Bolshevik cage, tortured by the communists. So I think if we look at the way it worked out there, it's impossible to think of him doing anything other than what he did, given the fact that he was determined not to survive. I believe Hitler might have decided to kill himself a long time ago. He knew, at some point, he knew the war was lost, and then just waiting for the moment, I guess, waiting for the moment to pull. When he first married, he got married. His longtime companion, and I guess we could say mistress, Eva Braun. Adolf and Eva got married and had a sort of a somber wedding ceremony and a little reception with tea and cakes. And then they killed themselves that evening. You can see Ava Brown, when she signed the marriage certificate, she'd been Ava Brown for so long, she wrote Ava B and had to cross it out. Now she's Ava Hitler, she always wanted to be in her life. So it's a strange ending. There's so many movies on the final moments in the bunker. I guess they'll never die. People are fascinated with those last minutes. So we had two down here. I'm not sure which order, you and then gentleman right behind you. So go in any order you guys think is right. Okay?
Thank you. What are your thoughts on the effects of Allied bombing on German civilian morale, particularly January to April of 1945?
That's a really good question. We're putting together right now, the History Channel is putting together a 20-part series of documentary on World War II, and so I'm going through all the episodes. I'm the consultant, whatever you call it. And this is a question we're dealing with right now. All the bombs that the Allies threw on Germany, and they threw a lot of bombs on Germany. They bombed every big German city into smithereens, and again, I'll mention it one more time, Dresden has continued to stand out because of the incendiary aspect to it. There is absolutely no evidence that they did much, that any of that bombing did much to crack German civilian morale. And if you think about it, people bomb your home, you get mad at them, you get angry at them. Hitler's been telling the German people the Allies are barbarians, and now look. But even more than that, your neighborhood's been obliterated, the water mains have been broken, there's no electricity. Who do you rely on to put things back together? The government. And in some sense, even if you're the local power company, you're beholden to, you're part of the Nazi command structure. So I think the Air Force did surveys on this at the end of the war. There's been a number of studies done since. And I think it's possible to say that all those bombs really don't crack civilian morale. The German bombs didn't crack London's morale. Bombing didn't crack Japanese morale until perhaps the final two bombs, which we'll talk to you about that in the last session. So it's an interesting question. All the destruction, whether it was even efficient, whether it was efficacious in any way, it's possible to look at the situation now and say no. Sure. Sir.
How do you define, or how do you get all the soldiers to agree the war is over? Because I know it takes time to get every soldier to stop firing. When does that transition go from you're shooting to kill someone for a war? When does that turn into like a crime?
This is a good question. So good. Let me take this. We did a lot of programming at the National World War II Museum about end of the war, VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. And trying to choose an actual day is very, very difficult. This is a fronts that run from the North Sea all the way, actually to the Arctic in Norway, and all the way down to Sicily in the south. And troops are engaged in various places. There's German troops in the Balkans. There's German troops still in Eastern Europe and of course, defending Central and Western Germany. So it's not like you just put a flag up. War's over. Think about the time zone problem. The Allies finally get, they get the Germans to agree to unconditional surrender. The Germans send out their staff officer, Alfred Jodl. He goes up to Reims, R-E-I-M-S, in France. He signs the papers, and there's all kinds of reporters, flashbulbs, popping. War's over. The Soviets say, no, the war isn't over. That's not the official surrender. It has to be to us. We did most of the damage. And so there's a second surrender ceremony that takes place in Berlin. With the Soviets, roust some German generals out and get them to sign the papers. There had already been partial surrenders in the Netherlands. Field Marshal Montgomery, the British Field Marshal there, he had already taken the surrender. There was a partial German surrender already at the end of April in Italy, in northern Italy. So at least 4 separate surrenders and probably some local ones after that. So they all say, if you're ever involved in this process, you got to bring an end to a world war. Use Greenwich Mean Time or something. You have to agree on what time it is when the war is going to end. Now, Soviet Union, I think Russia today still, but the Soviet Union in 1945 had 11 time zones. You're trying to figure out exactly what you're talking to Stalin. Is he asleep? What time is it? And you're in central France, or you're in Berlin at the time. So these questions are extraordinarily difficult. And here's what you don't want. You don't want to be the last man killed in World War II because somebody misread the time. So it has to be very, very obvious. You never say it's done now. You always say, as of 11 o'clock tomorrow, Greenwich Mean Time, the firing, or whatever. I'm making those up. That's actually World War I. But you have to find a time zone, and you have to agree on it. It has to be a day or two in advance. But World War I, World War II, that's the one I'm talking about. Right? World War II kind of stumbled to an end. It's not somebody put up a flag and all of a sudden it's over. But any great conflict, even if the Russians and Ukrainians agree to some kind of terms and agree to stop that war, it's going to be a complicated document of where the fighting stops in each sector that they agree. We got a few people. Okay, I see over here. We're trying to get them to it. Yes.
Okay. So during your talk, you mentioned about the no surrender and total war.
Yes.
Did that policy also apply to like the minor powers that the Axis had, including Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria?
Short, complex subject, but short answer, yes. I mentioned the big three, but you've already mentioned some of the other smaller Axis powers. You mentioned Hungary, Romania. Finland had been an Axis power, then left the Axis and joined the Allies late in the war. So there's a version of absolute surrender of unconditional surrender for virtually every one of them. Very often, justice was taken into the hands of the local population. Antonescu in Romania, the dictator in Romania, several others across the board, set upon by a mob and killed, famously Mussolini. Mussolini grabbed out of his car by communist partisans in northern Italy and shot and hanged from a local gas station in Milan next to the body of his So there's rough justice is being meted out at the end, but all the Axis powers did have to subscribe to unconditional surrender. Finland, I mentioned Finland because it's an anomalous situation. They had, at the end, they turned away from the Axis and actually helped drive the Germans off the soil. Something that won them some respect from the Allied power. Won some friends in the Allied camp at the time they needed it. Okay, right there, and we're going to work our way over to here. I see our microphone.
So, if I'm correct in my understanding, Hitler was actively encouraging other Germans to get married and have children. Why do you think that he didn't follow that advice himself? Obviously, he got married at the end, but prior to that.
I'm thinking of President Obama, famously got some questions asked. He said, "That's above my pay grade." Why did you do that? There were OSS studies, the forerunner of our CIA, the OSS Office of Special Services, that claimed that Hitler was incapable of having children. That he might have had a case of monorchidism. Feel free to look that one up. That is a problem with this. It prevents him from fathering children. But he himself said probably the first time that was spoken from the stage in quite a time. He himself said repeatedly, "I cannot marry. My only devotion, I can't have devotion to a wife. My only devotion must be to the German people." And it was all fine words. At the end, he wanted to destroy the German people. So I don't know if we can take him at his word there. But I also don't know whether to believe any of these somewhat fanciful theories about why Hitler was unwilling or unable to father children. We had people waiting down here. I see over there, promising issues too. So who had our hand up over? There were some folks who hands up over, right? Okay.
So this is kind of a long question.
All right.
But Hitler is known as one of the most verbally persuasive politicians of all time, and yet he believed he could not maintain morale in his troops without violence. And it's kind of painted a lot that Allied leaders are mediocre at speeches in comparison. So first of all, how do you think as humans we are preconditioned to respond to freedom versus force? And secondly, do you think it could have been more effective for his campaign to remain with the Allies are barbarians argument rather than proving his own barbarian nature with internal violence?
Wow. Those are all, I mean, there's a series of interrelated questions, but I think it does get down to one thing. Eloquence, let's say Hitler had eloquence. Eloquence is a dangerous attribute. It all depends on what he's being eloquent for. Petrarch, back in the Renaissance, said, you know, sapientia and eloquencia are two gifts that God has given the human race. Wisdom, the ability to know what's right and wrong, that's wisdom at its right. And then eloquence, the ability to persuade others that your path is the right one. One without the other, right? Sapientia, wisdom without eloquence is worthless. So maybe you're a happier person, but you're not doing any good for the people around you. But eloquence without sapientia, that is eloquence without wisdom, is positively dangerous. And if there's ever been a better example of it than Adolf Hitler, I don't know. Interesting that one thing Hitler did almost never in the last couple of years of the war is give a public speech. When they tried to kill him, his officer tried to kill him in July of 1944, he went on the radio. People said, wow, we haven't heard that voice in a long time. He said, I'm alive. They tried to set off a bomb, they did. It killed some people in the room, but not me, and I'm still here. Dastardly plot, we're going to wreak vengeance on their pretty typical Hitlerian rhetoric there towards the end. But one thing he withdrew. Hitler was able to feed on success, energy in a room. But what Hitler was famously difficult at doing is reacting when there was a setback. And it's interesting to me, I think eloquence, so Hitler made these bones, if you will, as a politician. Being able to take this audience here and just turn you into howling animals. Very good at it. And he was speaking to populations in Germany who were very, very angry about the way World War I had ended, about the collapse of the economy, about the inflation, and violence in the streets, law and order. He was very good at that sort of thing. But what he always had a difficult time doing, and I think he proved it over and over again in the war, is shifting back to sort of scramble mode. Roosevelt and Churchill were great scramblers. Things didn't look like they were going well. Churchill was able usually to pull something out of that, some speech, some turn of phrase. Think of all of Churchill's greatest speeches. The country's getting bombed. You know, that's not a good thing. Most politicians would, wow, what are the polling numbers going to be on this, Sam? You know, we're getting bombed. But instead, Churchill turned that on his ear. You know, let's comport ourselves so if the British Empire and its Commonwealth should last 1,000 years, men will still say this was it, right? So that's all anyone remembered about being bombed after it was over. So he was able to scramble. Roosevelt's great scramble came in his first inaugural. People are afraid, but the only thing you should really be afraid of is fear itself. That's the problem. Fear paralyzes you. We can't make needed reforms while we're sitting cowering in a room. That to me is kind of verbal scrambling. Three great speechifiers went to war with one another in World War II. Not Stalin. No one would want to sit through a speech by Stalin. And no one would want to sit through a speech by Tojo. The emperor almost never spoke. He was a divine figure and rarely gave public addresses and sort of Western politicians. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but certainly Hitler could have gone before the German people and tried to explain to them what was happening. Instead, the regime spun a web of nonstop lies to the end of the war. And what that meant is that, for example, the Soviets overran Eastern Germany. You say that in a simple sentence. 12 million Germans had been living in these districts for the last 400 years. They had to put everything they owned on a buggy or a cart and try to schlep themselves across the continent in the middle of winter. Hundreds of thousands of people died. Had there been earlier evacuation order, it didn't have to be that way. So I try to be on the one hand, on the other hand, I'm a historian, I want to be fair, I want to make sure everybody gets their due. It's hard to say much good about Hitler's late war leadership.
Can you say a little bit about the activities of resistance movements in Western Europe in the last year?
I think the resistance really came alive once the Western Allies landed on the continent. I mean, now they have an army, a friendly army within marching distance if they needed it. But I really think the finest hours for the resistance were before the Allies landed, when it looked like Hitler was the master of Europe and would be the master of Europe for the rest of anyone's lives. There were enough men and women in all the occupied European countries to say that's not the image of the future that we accept. They did it in France, they did it in Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy to a certain extent. That's complicated. It was Mussolini regime there, but even Italy in 1942 and 1943. So I always tell my friends and students who are talking about World War II, if you fancy yourself an author and you want to get a book published, find a resistance figure. Right now, the publishing world can't get enough of them. Especially find a woman resistance fighter. Get a quote from Hitler. She's the most dangerous woman in Europe. Whatever it might be, put that on the cover. Your book will sell, and then it will be turned into a movie. It's almost guaranteed now. There's an unlimited desire. And I understand why. Well, the gender issues, of course, because we tended to look at World War II. Some of the guys did, and women didn't play a role in that. But there's a bigger human issue beyond gender here, I think. And we want to read that even if Adolf Hitler took over my hometown, there'd be enough people in this place to tell them to get lost. There'd be people willing to put their lives on the line, willing to risk everything to make sure they lived in a free country. I think the resistance is a very, very inspiring story. Once the Soviets have broken in, the Western Allies have broken in, and there are big Allied armies on the continent, the resistance has a much stronger position because they actually have friends on the continent. But for me, it's before that happened, which I think is the real juicy story of the resistance in wartime. It's in every country. We have to get the mic. So one over here, this gentleman has had his hand up for a while now. And who's this? Look, you've got to get your mic just so everyone can hear your question. Yes.
Could you perhaps illustrate the state of the German government between Hitler's suicide in late April and the formal collapse and dissolution of the German government in early May 1945?
Yes, we often say the Third Reich died with Hitler, but that's not true. Hitler shot himself, but he had already signed the last will and testament, handing over the government of Germany, of Nazi Germany, to a admiral in the German navies, and Karl Dönitz. Dönitz was the U-boat man, wolf packs. He had a lot of success in his professional field. But he was also a loyal Nazi to the core. I think it's probably possible to say that virtually all the top officers in the German army. And so he forms what is sometimes called a shadow government. Shadow government means you're sitting in existence, but your authority doesn't really carry very far from the room you're in. He set up a shadow government in the Danish town of Flensborg, so it's southern tip of Schleswig-Holstein, northern Europe, not yet occupied by the Allies. And he continued to hand out proclamations. He gave a radio address and said the German people will fight to the bitter end in memory of their Führer. He didn't. No one really responded to that call. There's only one Hitler, and Dönitz didn't have anyone in that kind of political reputation. But he does have a little government. He sends out members of the delegates to government to negotiate with the Allies. Of course, by now the Allies are unhappy because they're in occupation of virtually the entire country. Hitler shot himself. The end of the war looks in sight. It's a kind of ignominious ending. So you invite a big war with the greatest military power of the time, Nazi Germany. And then at the end, you just send military police and have Dönitz and his government arrested. So it wasn't even, you can't even say he was taken prisoner. As far as the Allies were concerned, the Germans had signed unconditional surrender. And they didn't need the approval of Dönitz, and they weren't going to negotiate with Dönitz. So they made a specific, the language used at the time always speaks of arrest. You were arrested a criminal. You negotiate with a foreign government, but you arrest a common criminal. And that's how Dönitz and the others were treated. So there is, I want to say 2 weeks, is it May 15th? I don't have a date in my mind, but it's roughly 2 weeks from Hitler's death to the arrest of the caretaker Nazi regime under Adolf Hitler.
So what was the turning point of the Battle of the Bulge, and what were the tactics and strategies employed by the Allies?
Yes, that's a good question. If I can, I'm still working here. So, the Battle of the Bulge, probably more quickly than it should be narrated, but the Germans had 3 armies, the 7th Army, the 5th Panzer Army, and then the 6th Panzer Army, made up of SS formations under famous General Dietrich. They found a weak spot on the American line, and on December 16th, they attacked it. One of the reasons the surprise was so total is the weather was bad, and Allied air forces were running. The Allies have a real advantage, a big U.S. advantage, is air power. They're overhead all the time, and if they can't fly, they're not overhead. So the Germans managed to leverage that success and blow a pretty good hole, 20 miles or so wide, in the American line at west. They're trying to get to the coast, to Antwerp, big Allied supply base. If they can get Antwerp, they'll be able to stretch out the war by many, many months. The Allies will really, really be set back. So, I mean, those are the arrows, and you see the Germans heading west. A couple of positions. Elsenborn in the north, Solvit, Bastogne, the Americans managed here to hold. It's bad, it's winter, or I said the weather's bad. That cuts both ways. That's not going to be an attacker either. Germans are nowhere near topped off with enough fuel to carry out this kind of operation. And the plans call for the Germans to seize whatever Allied supply dumps they can find and use their gasoline. They haven't used the same fuel at the time, so no problem. At one point, the 5th Panzer Army, von Heufel, there, the commander, was heading toward Bastogne. He's about a mile from the biggest Allied supply depot in Europe. It's Stalingrad. But he doesn't know it. It's not on his map. So there's sort of a what if for you. So that's the operational shape. The American line actually eventually stiffens. The Germans have made a penetration, a bulge, if you're ever wondering why it's the Battle of the Bulge in the Allied lines. But they're not able to go any further with that. And the Americans finally turn on them. From the south, wouldn't be a World War II talk. The son of General George S. Patton Jr. From the south, the 3rd U.S. Army attacks north and marches to Bastogne, relieves the troops in sort of a very heroic story. You asked a deeper question, though, what are the tactics like? See, this map, this is an operational sketch. What it doesn't show you is what it's like to get through the Ardennes forest at any time of the year, let alone in deep winter. It's second old growth forest. It's got rocky gorges and meandering rivers. There's a water crossing seemingly every 30 seconds. Even if you're hiking through the Ardennes, it's not easy to get through. And so that cuts both ways. It's tough for the defenders and it's tough for the attackers. And what you have here is nitty-gritty infantry combat of the sort that generates gigantic casualties on both sides. The Americans are eventually able to prevail. They have superior resources. The sky's clear. The weather turns nice. American Air Force back in the skies. But the real issue, I've always thought, thinking about the Ardennes, is try to divorce yourself from this map and just think about groups of 10 to 15 men, all on both sides, all across 100 miles of terrain, trying to fight their way through a nearly impenetrable forest. It's horrific. And again, it's so horrific that because it generated a vast number of casualties. I mentioned 81,000 for the Americans. I should throw the Germans in 100,000. It's 200,000 human beings were killed in the space of a couple weeks of fighting in this war.
We have time for 2 more.
Someone has made that decision, so very good. 2 more. Okay, so got one here, one here? Oh, there was one there, sorry. Take 3 more.
Okay, 3 more.
So you remember, okay. No, go here first. There were a couple people here.
Where am I going?
Go to Wash.
To wash?
I'm actually just curious how important was Eisenhower's strategy to proceed along a broad front to ensure that the Battle of the Bulge didn't actually end up being successful?
Yeah. Big debate in World War II studies amongst the cognoscenti of whether Eisenhower was following the right strategy. There's something military commanders refer to as the operational art. And here, you arrange your forces in a way that you're weak in some places and powerful in others. You lure the adversary in where you're weak, and then you're able to amass huge forces in places he's not expecting. You surprise him, you drive him back in disarray, operational art. That's not Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower believed in something called a broad front advance. And you don't have to be a commander to understand this. You have 100 miles of front, and you have 5 armies. Tell me, how much front does each army get? 100 miles of front, 5 armies. 20 miles apiece. There's nothing clever about it. There's no attempt to surprise. Eisenhower felt we have superior resources, and if we just move forward, we will prevent the Germans ever, on all fronts at all times, we'll prevent the Germans from ever amassing a sufficient reserve to do what they need here. Now, in December of 1944, it appeared that maybe Eisenhower had been mistaken, because the Germans were able to amass a lot of force against what turned out to be a relatively weak portion of the German army. I just can't see the Allies doing anything else. I think operational art is very risky. Eisenhower felt we are going to win this war, if not in 1944, it's claimed we were going to win in 1945. And it will be bloody. There's no way it's not going to be bloody. There's no magic solution to ending the German army's reign of terror. You're just going to have to beat it across the board. Why risk eventual victory for defeat tomorrow? Now, the problem is, people who read books on World War II want excitement. So when you read, because I think of being a general as a game of risk, or stratego when I was a kid. Stratego is the Greek word for general. So that's the art of generalship to me, doing clever things, surprise, pulling a rabbit out of a hat. But Eisenhower was took more of a business-like approach. The chairman of the board, so we'll just beat them across the board from end to end. There's one bad moment in the Bulge. The rest of the campaign, from the landing in Europe in June to the eventual German surrender in May of 1945, it worked. It didn't work like a dream, but it worked. Yes?
So you mentioned in your talk that World War I, the war that preceded World War II, of course, was a negotiated surrender. And similar to World War II, of course, the last year of World War I, 1918, bloodiest year of the war. And of course, what we don't see in World War I, but we do see in World War II, is the idea of unconditional surrender. So I was just wondering if you had an idea of why we see this unconditional surrender idea appear in World War II, but not in World War I.
Good question. Before I answer your question, he gets the last one over there.
Who?
This gentleman.
Oh.
Who's had his hand up a lot. So I just want to make sure.
Okay.
I don't want any anger as I'm exiting. No, it's a very good question, and I think I have the answer to it. The Allies demanded unconditional surrender in World War II precisely because of what happened when the Germans were not forced to surrender unconditionally in World War I. Most Germans had a hard time believing they'd been beaten decisively in World War I. There was an announcement of an armistice, and clear from reading the armistice that Germany had lost the war. There was not a single Allied soldier on German soil. The German army was deep in France, but mainly still in Belgium. And in the Soviet Union, in Russia, the German army was still deep in Ukraine. And so when the war came home, the armies came home on all sides, everyone was kind of bewildered. If there was one politician who built his career on this notion that Germany had not really been defeated in World War I, it was Adolf Hitler, the Fuhrer of World War II. There was a general belief amongst the Allied powers that Germany had not been taught the error of its ways sufficiently in World War I. But we should have fought out another 6 months until we actually invaded Germany. Did put some hurt on the Germans and the German people themselves. Roosevelt believed it, Churchill believed it, and probably the upper officer corps, you can see language like that repeated over and over again. So it is not by chance that World War I ended kind of messily, and then World War II ended with a demand for unconditional surrender. One leads directly to the other.
Yeah, I'm curious about some of the economic states, specifically the Soviet Union at the end of the war, because I imagine America and Britain were doing fine economically as the war was on their soil. Germany was probably in a terrible spot, but what about the Soviet Union in 44 and 45?
Yeah. The Soviet Union was an economic mess. It was vastly the case. The war was no longer on Soviet soil, and really hadn't been since 1944, so the last year of the war was not on Soviet soil, but the German occupation of much of the Soviet Union from 1941 to, let us say, early 1944 had overrun most of the most productive Soviet farmland. It had overrun numerous industrial areas, mines, facilities of all sorts. The Soviets, as you may know, had also dismantled their factories and carried them beyond the Ural Mountains, where they were safe from German attack. But you know, that came with its own cost. It's not like that's costless. You dismantle US steel and you cart it 500 miles to the east. It's going to cost a lot of money. The Soviet economy was not limitless in its ability to produce. So a long way of saying, this is the reason that in the end game of the war, the Soviets were demanding German reparations. The Americans and British saying, no, you can't do this. We've got to rebuild Germany. And Stalin was saying, rebuild Germany? They lost the war. We have to rebuild the Soviet Union first. Now, a lot of water flows under the bridge, Marshall Plan, you can go forward 5 years. But in the immediate end of the war, this is why the Soviets in every part of Eastern Germany that they occupied pretty much carted off everything that wasn't nailed down.
Please join me in thanking Robert Citino. The conference is off to a great start, but there's plenty more to come. 7:30 tonight, the best years of our lives at the Ashland Theater downtown. Our first panel tomorrow morning starts at 9, not here, but rather in Roth Lecture Hall in Shar. Hope to see you.
Good, how about you? Good, good. Yeah, it's early in the semester. This is one of the Keynote. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, keeping busy. They ran up to the airport this afternoon to pick up a couple of the panelists for tomorrow, you know, so anything serious, or is it like yeah. Yeah. I guess they forgot it.